It is good to meet you all, to those of you who I haven't had the pleasure of presenting to before. Um, my research covers the enforcement of the Chinese anti-monopoly law, or the AML. It effectively legally established antitrust mechanisms in China. It was introduced in 2008, um, and it sort of coincided with the culmination of several decades of, very intense GDP growth and a stark increase in foreign direct investment in China. That foreign direct investment sparked a lot of nationalist and protectionist sentiment within the country, due to the growing influence of foreign companies within the country. And so this piece of legislation has been investigated as a mechanism for China to promote its own industrial policy, in response to those sentiments and to counter a lot of the foreign influence in its economic sphere, often in anti-competitive ways, which are contrary to its original mission, I guess, of the legislation. So some evidence of this has been disproportionate merger review between domestic to domestic deals versus deals involving a foreign company, and cases like that. So the Chinese economy is also undergoing a massive transition, especially within the last 10 years. They have started to target more increasingly a shift from its manufacturing focus towards certain strategic sectors. So a key piece of that story is the Made in China 2025 initiative, which was introduced in 2015 and outlined several of these target sectors, towards which the Chinese economy hopes to transition in the move away from its manufacturing focus. So the question at the crux of this analysis is whether or not China's uneven enforcement of this antitrust regulation against foreign companies is strategically tied to its economic goals, specifically those involving its target sectors in the Made in China 2025 initiative. So the two data sources that I kind of looked at were first, a really large data set on the number of foreign invested enterprises in China, ranging from 2017 to 2019. Each year had around 300,000 firms, and they were organized by several classes of sector codes. So I chose to focus on the ISIC industry sector codes, and I parsed them out to the 2-digit level, just so we could get some more aggregation. Originally, they were in the 4-digit. And then the second data set was a list of AML cases between 2008 and 2014. There were 26 cases, specifically those with conditional approvals or rejections. So there were a lot more cases that were approved outright, but I was focusing on the ones which were marred by either a conditional approval or a rejection, because all of these involved a foreign firm. And that data was provided by the Ministry of Commerce in China, which is the main legislative body for the enforcement of the AML, as it pertained to the mergers and acquisitions specifically. So the table over here takes the relative frequencies of the ISIC 2 sector codes for the firms in both data sets. So the percentages or the frequencies of each were compared. And so you end up with this differential here. And we see that the types of firms or the ISIC 2 codes that were largely overrepresented in the cases, as opposed to the industrial distribution across the country when looking at total foreign invested firms. The industries that were most severely overrepresented often coincided pretty much one-to-one with the sectors targeted in the Made in China 2025 initiative. So the top three, especially computer electronic products, pharmaceuticals, and chemical products, those are listed out in kind of the strategically targeted industries laid out by the Made in China 2025 initiative. So essentially, the interesting result that we can kind of look to is this suggests that because of the different timeline between the introduction of the AML as well as the announcement of these target industries in the Made in China 2025 initiative, they were around 7 years apart. I think they were announced. We see that even though that the timelines are different, there seems to be a strategic usage of the earlier legislation in the direction of the strategy laid out by the initiative that was announced in 2015. And so this suggests that the enforcement of the antitrust legislation does indeed indicate signs of more strategic motivations, as opposed to the purely anti-competitive or purely competitive focused goals that were outlined in its conception. So some notes of further inquiry. First, I'd love to compare sort of on a case-by-case basis, how cases involving a foreign firm differed from cases that involved only domestic firms. So the kind of initial sign that something was potentially remiss in terms of the enforcement was the disproportionate merger review. So foreign firms only comprised under 10% of the mergers in China, but they comprised around 90% of the cases analyzed under the AML law. And so that was kind of an initial sign that perhaps there is something specific to foreign firms that the Chinese government is looking at. So comparing the types of enforcement and the conditions laid out in approvals and things like that, as well as parsing out more specific variables so we could control for those between cases involving a foreign firm versus purely domestic cases, would be a note of further inquiry. And it would provide kind of a counterfactual towards this result to see if, maybe this is just consistent across the enforcement. But overall, I think this is a really good first step into analyzing, I guess, how the Chinese enforcement of this antitrust legislation could mimic the pattern that we would expect were it to strategically target these industries in line with its industrial policy. So if anyone has any questions, I would love to hear them.
First of all, thanks. Really solid presentation. I learned a lot. Two questions for you. One is that this anti-monopoly law, it spans two, leadership regimes in the People's Republic of China. You made this comment about, hey, from 2015, we saw a fairly precise but accelerating use of this with respect to dovetailing it into the Made in China 2025 initiative to use AML in a precise way. Leadership influence, do you think that the leadership change was a factor?
That's a great question. I'd have to pull, I guess, more data from the more recent years of the AML, especially recently. I know Professor Zhang had mentioned to me that the legislative makeup of the AML and some of the other mechanisms that were introduced in the last couple of years would have introduced some, I guess, discrepancies between the most recent years and the early years. That's why I focused on kind of the initial years that were outlaid. But I'm not entirely sure as to how the leadership change specifically influenced the decisions or even the companies targeted. I'd have to look at more cases and expand the timeline a little bit just so I could have enough data from which to sort of begin to draw those conclusions or even just to look at that.
Understood. Thanks. And one more. So as this is going on, as you researched the anti-monopoly law back in 2008 and kind of running it into the present, WTO reactions, any? Or nope, hey, that's internal to the PRC. We're going to give it a pass. Other players in the WTO. What, as you researched this, was there anything that stood out, kind of as reaction from the WTO?
So, from the WTO as an institution, I didn't see anything, but I have to look into that more specifically. As far as other members, I know that one of the earliest sort of like announcements, or I guess reports on the potential for this being abused by the Chinese government for its industrial policy came from the US Chamber of Commerce. There's a pretty extensive report, around 100 pages, that looked into very specifically some of the accusations that were being levied against the Chinese government and the AML enforcement bodies, having to do with, not only disproportionate merger review, but also some of the case-by-case areas of concern. Another major Chamber of Commerce that had, published its concerns regarding the law was the EU. I don't remember specifically which cases they outlined, but one of the difficult things about Chinese legislative enforcement, especially as it pertains to this M&A work, is it's very hard to get data on, because one of the accusations being levied against the Ministry of Commerce, which is the main M&A enforcement body, is that there's been a lack of transparency with regards to why it makes certain decisions, as well as some of the reasoning behind its rejections and conditional approvals, because they've been accused of holding a double standard between, domestic firms and foreign firms, but it's rather difficult to parse out what's valid accusation and what's, not so much, just because the Ministry of Commerce keeps somewhat of a tight grip on its data, and the data that it does, I guess, put out there has been criticized for being somewhat vague and not very informative. So that's just part of the nature of dealing with Chinese data. It's, they have a very tight hold on what they like to let out, and they're not really going to want to publish or release information that, could very easily damn them. So I guess the hope there is to develop some data sources which try to work around that. I know there was one paper that tried to use, I think it was law firms and lawyers dealing with Chinese cases and the sentiment that they had with regards to it, but it was survey based and things like that. But you have to develop more sophisticated mechanisms to evaluate questions like that, just because the raw data is somewhat dubious sometimes, and even if it's available, it's not always the most informative.
Thanks.
Thanks, Shahab, for a really interesting presentation. I'm glad that Professor Thomas mentioned the WTO, because I was thinking of cases there as well that were analogous or potentially analogous. I remember the 2002 dispute where Brazil sued the US and the WTO for cotton subsidies that it deemed to be illegal. The WTO allowed Brazil to retaliate with tariffs on technology, on US like computer and electronics exports. The very next year, the US tried to ban, I think it was Antigua and Barbuda, from allowing online gambling services to the US. Antigua and Barbados sued the US, saying it violated the WTO, and they were allowed to retaliate by violating IP. So it's interesting in both of those cases, to me, related to your work, is we have the WTO making a determination about the specific sector where this country could retaliate, which they do to provide sort of political coverage for that country to do so and to make sure that it's fair, equitable, and proportional retaliation. That seems analogous or potentially related to what you're looking at, because it seems like there are cases where China is deciding what to do in these particular sectors based off of what it perceives to be the impact on potentially other countries, domestic actors, et cetera. And it's interesting that, part of the idea behind proportionality is that there might be some sweet spot. If a country or a sector or a company does something that the Chinese government doesn't like, they don't want to come raining down with everything they have. They also don't want to do something too light. There's some calculation about what we do in this particular sector will have the intended effect. And so I guess it's more of a comment than a question, but it seems sort of potentially relevant to what you're doing in terms of thinking through how an actor like the CCP would choose the sector where these sort of trade distorting measures, using the WTO's language, would have the intended effect.
Yeah, one kind of additional variable that I wanted to introduce, but just didn't get the chance, was the impact of asymmetry across these industries. So whether or not, a given bilateral trade relationship, if it was weighted a certain way against China or in China's favor, how that would impact the industries that it chose to target. Because there were certain industries that, weren't necessarily targeted in the 26 cases that I looked at. And, if the data set were larger, it might be a little bit more informative to I guess, evaluate how asymmetry factored in. But I would definitely be interested in that, especially after I factor in the domestic, purely domestic cases. There might be some like notes of comparison to look at there. So, but yeah, great comment.
Great, awesome.
Really interesting.